You wake up and within 60 seconds it starts. The phone, the notifications, the low-grade hum of something you can't name. And before you've even gotten out of bed, you've already done the thing. The same thing. The thing you swore last night you wouldn't do. Checked the app you said you'd delete. Sent the message you knew you shouldn't send. Reached for the comfort you promised yourself you'd outgrow. And here's what nobody tells you, the problem was never that you didn't know better. You know exactly what you should do. You've read the books. You've underlined the passages. You've made the promises to yourself and to everyone watching. And you still do the opposite. Not because you're weak. Not because you lack willpower. But because there's a part of you running the show that you've never even looked at. That's the costly mistake. You keep trying to fix the part of you that's visible while the part of you that's hidden keeps steering the wheel. And here's the thesis, the one idea I want you to hold on to: self-awareness isn't an insight you stumble into. It's a discipline you build through relentless observation of your own behavior. Knowing yourself without changing yourself is just decorated self-deception. The Stoics understood this 2,000 years ago. They didn't sit around having feelings about their feelings. They watched themselves like hawks. They treated their own minds as the most dangerous territory they'd ever enter. So let's go there. Let's talk about what's actually running you. There are forces beneath your awareness that shape almost everything you do. You don't feel them because they're not loud. They're not dramatic. They're the current beneath the surface. And you've been swimming in them so long you think the current is just the water. The first force is narcissism. Not the clinical kind. Not the personality disorder. The human kind. The quiet, persistent self-referencing that happens in every single one of us. You filter the world through how it affects you. You interpret other people's behavior as commentary on your worth. Someone doesn't text back and your mind doesn't think, they're busy. Your mind thinks, what did I do wrong? That's narcissism. Not malice. Just the gravitational pull of the self. And it operates whether you acknowledge it or not. The second force is grandiosity. The quiet belief that you're special. That your suffering is more meaningful than other people's suffering. That your potential is extraordinary and the world just hasn't noticed yet. Grandiosity is seductive because it feels like ambition. It feels like drive. But it's not drive. Drive moves you forward. Grandiosity keeps you standing still while telling yourself you're flying. It's the reason you can't take criticism. It's the reason you abandon projects the moment they get hard, because hard means you might be average, and average is the one thing grandiosity cannot survive. The third force is conformity. The deep, almost biological need to belong, to match the tribe, to signal that you're one of them. You think your opinions are your own. Most of them aren't. Most of them are inherited. You think your tastes reflect your individuality. Mostly they reflect your environment. Conformity is the reason you laugh at jokes that aren't funny. It's the reason you adopt opinions you can't defend. It's the reason you shrink yourself in rooms where you should be expanding. You're not being yourself. You're being what the room expects. The fourth force is aggression. Not the kind that throws punches. The kind that wears a smile. Aggression is the energy beneath your passive comments. It's the edge in your sarcasm. It's the pleasure you feel when someone you resent fails. It's the way you punish people for not giving you what you think you deserve, not through confrontation but through withdrawal, through silence, through the strategic withholding of warmth. Aggression doesn't have to be loud to be destructive. The quiet kind is worse because you can deny it even exists. These four forces, narcissism, grandiosity, conformity, aggression, they're not separate demons. They're layers of the same thing. The part of you you've never looked at. And they don't need your permission to operate. They operate in the gap between what you intend and what you do. That gap is where your life keeps leaking out. Here's what nobody wants to say out loud: you keep repeating the same destructive patterns not because you're unlucky, not because the world is against you, but because there's something inside you that needs the pattern. Something that finds the pain familiar. Something that would rather have a destruction it recognizes than a peace it doesn't. This is the law of compulsive behavior. People don't repeat destructive patterns out of stupidity. They repeat them because the pattern was laid down early, before they had language for it, before they had choice. And the pattern isn't just a behavior. It's a wound wearing a costume. You keep dating the same kind of person because that dynamic feels like home, even if home was a place where you got hurt. You keep quitting when things get hard because somewhere early on you learned that effort leads to disappointment, so you preempt the disappointment by withdrawing. You keep self-sabotaging at the edge of success because success would mean becoming someone your family wouldn't recognize, and belonging is more important to your nervous system than thriving. The compulsion doesn't care about your goals. It doesn't care about your vision board. It doesn't care about the version of yourself you perform for other people. It cares about one thing: recreating the familiar. Even if the familiar is pain. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. You already know this. Somewhere in your body, you already know this. You've felt the pattern. You've watched yourself do the thing and felt that strange, dissociative sensation of watching yourself from across the room. You've said the words, "Why do I keep doing this?" And then you answered yourself with another question, or a distraction, or a justification, and you moved on. You named the pattern. You felt the pattern. And you changed nothing. That's the real problem. Not the pattern. The refusal to act on what you see. Self-knowledge without behavioral change is just decorated self-deception. It's the most sophisticated form of avoidance available to a smart person. You think because you can articulate your trauma, you've processed it. You think because you can name your attachment style, you've healed it. You think because you can identify your triggers, you're no longer triggered. But naming is not the same as changing. Articulating is not the same as transforming. You've just gotten better at describing the cage. You haven't opened the door. The Stoics would have looked at modern self-help culture and seen it for what it is, a sophisticated avoidance system. Marcus Aurelius didn't sit in his tent on the Danube frontier, surrounded by war and plague and political betrayal, and write about his feelings. He wrote about what to do. He wrote about the gap between knowing and doing, and he wrote about it with a ruthless honesty that most people today would find unbearable. He wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events. That's not a platitude. That's an operational directive. It means the work isn't in understanding your pain. The work is in changing your response to it. The work is in the doing. Epictetus said it even more bluntly. He said, "Don't explain your philosophy. Embody it. Don't tell me what you believe. Show me what you do. Because what you do is what you actually believe. Everything else is decoration." So how do you actually break the pattern? Not by understanding it more. Not by journaling harder. Not by buying another book. You break it by watching yourself with a cold, patient, relentless attention that most people never apply to themselves. Here's the practice. And it's not glamorous. Stop introspecting. Start observing. There's a difference, and the difference matters more than anything I'm going to tell you. Introspection is when you sit with your feelings and try to figure out why you have them. Observation is when you watch what you do and let the behavior tell you who you are. Introspection is a story you tell yourself about yourself. Observation is the truth you can't argue with. When you introspect, you're inside the pattern. You're the fish trying to understand water while swimming in it. When you observe, you step outside. You become the person on the riverbank watching the fish. You see the current. You see the direction. You see the repetition. And because you can see it, you can eventually choose not to swim in it. Here's what this looks like in practice. Tomorrow morning, when you reach for your phone, don't ask yourself why. Don't try to understand the impulse. Just watch the hand move. Watch the fingers unlock the screen. Watch the eyes scan the notifications. Watch the body tense slightly. Watch the breath shallow. Don't judge it. Don't fix it. Just see it. See the machine running. Because here's what happens when you see the machine running. For the first time, there's a gap between you and the machine. And in that gap, something extraordinary becomes possible. Choice. The Stoics called this the inner citadel. Not a metaphor for strength. A metaphor for awareness. The part of you that watches is not the part of you that acts. When you can separate the watcher from the actor, you stop being a passenger in your own life. You become the one who decides. Most people never develop this watcher. They live entirely inside their reactions. Something happens, they react. Something triggers them, they lash out or shut down. They feel an impulse, they follow it. There's no space between stimulus and response because they've never practiced creating that space. And without that space, there is no freedom. There's only the pattern, running on autopilot, wearing the mask of personality. Here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud: you don't have a personality. You have a pattern. What you call your personality is just the collection of reactions you've repeated so many times they feel like identity. You say, "I'm just not a morning person." No. You're a person who has repeated the same morning behavior for years and called it identity. You say, "I'm just anxious." No. You're a person who has repeated the same anxious responses to uncertainty until they became automatic. You say, "I always do this." And that's the only honest part. You always do this. You always. That's compulsion. That's the pattern. And the pattern is not who you are. It's what you do when you're not paying attention. So start paying attention. Not to your feelings. To your behavior. Feelings are weather. They move through you. They don't define the terrain. Behavior is the terrain. Behavior is the record. Behavior is what actually happened, not what you felt about what happened. When you start observing your behavior instead of interrogating your feelings, something shifts. You stop being the patient on the couch and you become the scientist in the lab. Your life becomes data. And data doesn't lie. Data doesn't rationalize. Data doesn't tell you a comforting story about why you did what you did. Data just shows you what you did. And what you did is who you are, until you decide to be someone else. Carl Jung understood this. He called the hidden part of you the shadow. Not because it's evil. Because it's in the dark. The shadow is everything about you that you refuse to see. Your narcissism. Your grandiosity. Your aggression. Your conformity. The parts of yourself that make you uncomfortable. The parts you've disowned, projected onto others, blamed the world for. And Jung said something that most people miss: until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That's what's happening right now. You're calling your pattern fate. You're saying, this is just how I am. This is just how things go for me. I always end up here. That's not fate. That's a compulsion you haven't observed closely enough to interrupt. Here's how you interrupt it. You stop trying to be different and you start watching yourself be exactly who you are. You watch without flinching. You watch the pettiness. You watch the envy. You watch the way you perform kindness for applause. You watch the way you retreat when someone sees through you. You watch the way you sabotage intimacy because intimacy requires vulnerability and vulnerability feels like the original wound. You watch all of it. And you don't look away. Because here's the paradox: the part of you you're afraid to look at is the part of you that has the most power to change you. Not because it's wise. Because once you see it, it can't hide anymore. And patterns can only survive in the dark. The moment you shine a steady, unblinking light on a pattern, it starts to lose its grip. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But steadily, the way dawn erodes the night. You don't have to fight the pattern. You just have to stop looking away from it. Now, there's a specific pattern I want to address because it might be the most destructive one of all. Comparison. You look at other people and you measure yourself against them. Their success. Their body. Their relationship. Their followers. Their ease. And every time you compare, you lose. Not because they're better. Because you're competing in a game with no rules and no finish line, using a scoreboard that exists entirely in your head. The Stoics had a different approach. They turned the comparison inward. Not inward as in, compare yourself to an idealized version of yourself. That's just grandiosity wearing a spiritual costume. Inward as in, compete with who you were yesterday. Not with strangers today. The only meaningful question is not, am I better than them? The only meaningful question is, am I more honest than I was? Am I more disciplined than I was? Am I closer to the person I said I'd be? Not the person they said I should be. The person I said I'd be. When you compete with strangers, you're competing with ghosts. You don't know their struggle. You don't know their cost. You see their highlight reel and you compare it to your raw footage. That's not a competition. That's a self-inflicted wound. And it feeds every hidden force we talked about. It feeds narcissism because it makes everything about your image. It feeds grandiosity because it sets impossible standards. It feeds conformity because it measures your worth by the tribe's metrics. It feeds aggression because it turns life into a zero-sum game where someone else's win is your loss. Turn it inward. Today, ask yourself one question. Not, what did I accomplish? Not, how do I look? One question, what did I do today that the person I was yesterday couldn't have done? Maybe it's small. Maybe you held your tongue when you wanted to lash out. Maybe you stayed with a difficult feeling instead of numbing it. Maybe you did the thing you were avoiding. Maybe you just got through the day without surrendering to the pattern. That's not small. That's everything. Because yesterday's version of you would have done the old thing. Today's version did something different. That's growth. Not the kind that looks good on a stage. The kind that changes the wiring. And here's the thing about changing the wiring. It's slow. It's unglamorous. Nobody claps. Nobody notices. You don't get a certificate. You don't get a post. You just wake up one day and realize you haven't done the old thing in a while. Not because you fought it. Because you watched it long enough that it lost its power. You observed the compulsion so many times, with such steady, unflinching attention, that the gap between impulse and action widened. And in that gap, you found something you didn't know you had. Choice. That's what the Stoics were really after. Not suppression. Not control. Choice. The ability to see the pattern, feel the pull, and decide. Not decide perfectly. Not decide once and be done. Decide in every moment the pattern rears its head. Decide again and again and again, until the new decision becomes the new pattern. Because that's how patterns work. They're not broken by insight. They're broken by repetition. The same force that built the old pattern builds the new one. Repetition. The only difference is that this time, the repetition is chosen. Now I want to talk about something that ties all of this together. Something the Stoics treated as the ultimate corrective for every hidden force we've discussed. Your mortality. I know. Nobody wants to hear about death. It's the ultimate buzzkill in a culture built on distraction. But the Stoics didn't bring up death to depress you. They brought it up to clarify you. Seneca said that learning how to live is learning how to die. Not in a morbid way. In a liberating way. When you accept that your time is finite, that every day is a resource you're spending and never getting back, something sharpens. The narcissism softens because you realize the universe doesn't revolve around you and never did. The grandiosity collapses because you realize you won't be here long enough to become the legend you're chasing. The conformity loosens because you realize the tribe's approval won't follow you into the ground. The aggression burns off because you realize the grudges you're carrying are dead weight, and carrying dead weight is exhausting when you have so little time. Mortality is the antidote to every hidden force because it strips away everything that doesn't matter and leaves only what does. And what matters, when you're honest about it, is not how you appeared. It's how you lived. Not what you accumulated. What you became. Not who impressed you. Who you helped. Not what you performed. What you actually felt. You keep repeating the same patterns because you've been living as though you have infinite time to fix them. As though the pattern is a problem you can address later. As though the version of you that will finally get it together is waiting somewhere in the future, patient and ready. That person doesn't exist. There is only this version of you. Right now. Listening. With all your patterns, all your wounds, all your hidden forces, all your potential. This is the version that has to decide. Not tomorrow. Now. Here's what I want you to understand, and I want you to feel this, not just hear it. The pattern is not your enemy. The hidden forces are not your enemy. Narcissism, grandiosity, conformity, aggression, they're not demons to be exorcised. They're parts of you that developed for a reason. They protected you. They helped you survive environments that required them. They got you here. The problem isn't that they exist. The problem is that you're still running software that was written for a world you no longer live in. And you haven't updated it because you haven't looked at it. You've been too busy performing a version of yourself that doesn't need updating. The update doesn't come from reading more. It doesn't come from understanding more. It comes from watching yourself more. From the kind of radical, honest, uncomfortably clear observation that most people never practice because it requires them to see things about themselves they'd rather not see. But here's the thing about what you'd rather not see, it's running you anyway. You not looking at it doesn't make it stop. It makes it stronger. Because the pattern feeds on denial. It thrives in the gap between who you say you are and who you actually are. And the bigger that gap, the more powerful the pattern. So close the gap. Not by being harder on yourself. Not by adding more rules. Not by promising to be better. Close the gap by watching. By observing. By seeing yourself as you actually are, not as you perform yourself to be. And then, slowly, patiently, without drama, without announcement, begin to choose differently. Not because you understand the pattern now. Because you can see it. And what you can see, you can change. Self-awareness isn't an insight. It's a discipline. It's not something that happens to you. It's something you practice. Every day. Every moment. Watching the hand reach for the phone. Watching the impulse to retreat. Watching the urge to compare. Watching the pull of the old pattern. And in the space between seeing and doing, choosing. Choosing the thing the old you couldn't have chosen. Choosing it quietly. Choosing it again tomorrow. You already know what to do. That was never the problem. The problem was the part of you you've never looked at. So look at it. All of it. The ugly, the petty, the scared, the grandiose, the conforming, the aggressive. Look at it without flinching. And then do the one thing that changes everything, act on what you see. Not later. Now. Not perfectly. Just honestly. Most people call this self-improvement. The Stoics would call it waking up. And the truth is, you've been asleep for a long time. Not because you're lazy. Not because you're broken. Because the part of you that's been steering has been doing it in the dark, and you never turned on the light. So turn it on. Watch yourself. All of yourself. And start building the only thing that ever actually matters, a self you don't have to perform. A self that's real. Not because you've eliminated the darkness. Because you've seen it, named it, and chosen to walk a different road despite it. The pattern doesn't break in a moment of revelation. It breaks in 1,000 small moments of observation. 1,000 quiet decisions to see what's there and act on what you see. That's the discipline. That's the practice. That's the whole thing. Stay awake.